and welcome to episode 24 of the Know-It-Alls. I'm Alden O'Brien, and I get to introduce tonight because tonight we are focusing on a selection of quilts from the DAR Museum, where I have the great good fortune to be the curator of costume and textiles. And we've focused in other episodes on a couple of other collections and invited curators from those collections to talk about something from their collection. And this time we get to focus on the DAR, where Debby has also spent many years working with the collection. So she will talk about one of the quilts that she has spent a lot of time doing research on. And much of our cataloging owes a great deal to her and to Virginia Viss, who were my mentors in my early years as quilt curator, because I'm first and foremost a costume person. So I always like to acknowledge my debt to their guidance and confidence building. So I believe we are starting with Lynne Bassett, who is going to be looking at some of her favorite in-depth research subjects, quilted petticoats, one of the quilted petticoats in our collection, which she has some really interesting new information on. So take it away, Lynne.
Okay, I am presenting from my bed in my pajamas because I have COVID. So please excuse my voice. This is an update on my presentation from about a year ago, where I was talking about these quilted petticoats in preparation for this exhibition that I did at the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut. I got the contract for this exhibition a month before everything shut down for COVID, which has finally caught up with me. So anyway, there was a lot of research I couldn't do until recently. And so I have an update on the quilted petticoat, especially to put into context the quilted petticoat in the DAR collection. So this exhibition focused on southeastern Connecticut, and in the process of that research, I found that there was a very strong link to Newport, Rhode Island. And so since the exhibition, 10 more of these petticoats have come to my attention, adding a lot of new data to my database. And of those 25, there are 12 that have reliable histories. 9 of them come from Rhode Island, and 3 of them come from Stonington, Connecticut. And then there's a 14th that is said to have come from Norwich, but they don't know where in Norwich. So I have a map here with Rhode Island outlined, and you can see that the area I'm looking at right here is basically New London County. This is the area I'm talking about for the exhibition, but right now I'm really going to be talking about Rhode Island. So this area, it's really important to understand, is totally tied in to maritime trade and very much tied into the triangle trade, which is slaves, sugar, molasses, rum, the circular trade in these things. And I find that these petticoats are very much connected in that. So in the process of researching these, I discovered that there is a possible, maybe probable connection to Sarah Osborne, who was the most significant schoolmistress in Newport in the mid-18th century. And it's my process of researching her and trying to find these Newport connections that led me to these discoveries. So first discovery since the exhibition was figuring out who the actual owner of this petticoat was. This is from Fort Ticonderoga collection, and it was said to have descended in the family of the founders of Fort Ticonderoga. So I did the genealogy, backing up, and found Mary Chaloner Channing, who was married in 1746. 1746 is quilted into the petticoat. So, and she's the great-great-grandmother of Sarah Pell, who was a founder of Fort Ticonderoga. So anyway, I feel pretty confident that she's the owner of this petticoat. And I just want to point out the Great Britain's royal, or the coat of arms here. This is something that ties these petticoats together. And the thing that I was trying to do was finding connections to Sarah Osborne. Well, Mary Challoner Channing went to the same church as Sarah Osborne. So that was a pretty cool connection. She married a merchant who was also a slave trader. She was a slave owner. Sarah Osborne, actually, who was also a slave owner, taught Mary Challoner Channing's slave's husband. She ran a school for Black residents of Newport on Sunday evenings. So anyway, so these petticoats I'm using to kind of build a picture of the community. This was my big breakthrough that I couldn't have found until after things opened up. Abigail Trowbridge is embroidered, or is quilted into this petticoat, but nobody could find who Abigail Trowbridge was. I found her, fortunately, because I went looking at the American Antiquarian Society, just looking for needles and haystacks. I wanted to look at just mid-18th century documents from Newport, just to see what I could find. And so I pulled out an account book by John Challoner, who happens to be Mary Challoner Channing's brother. And in this account book, he noted not only his customers' names, but what they did. And so he had Captain Trowbridge, privateer. And I was like, oh, Captain Trowbridge, privateer. And so I Googled Trowbridge privateer, and I came up with a list of British privateer captains in the 18th century. And there he was, Ebenezer Trowbridge. And so with his name, his full name, I was able to find his marriage record. And who did he marry? He married Abigail Wilson in 1740. So she's in the right place at the right time, with a petticoat with the British coat of arms, and they're totally tied into the British government, because it's the British government that is licensing the privateers, which is basically just a legalized form of pirating. And it was the absolute height of privateering in Newport in the 1740s and 1750s. So it all fits in. Okay, so then we have another one of these petticoats with the coat of arms on it. This one belonged to Sarah Larkin. She was in Richmond, which is just to the west of Newport. And her father was a captain in the French and Indian War. And so again, another family that's very connected to sort of British authority. And so then we get to the DAR's petticoat. Now this one has lost its history. And so we have to think about it a little differently, but look at it compared to the Sarah Larkin petticoat. It has the same very elaborate upper half. It has the same border here. It has the same pear tree. And the thing about this is that it totally fits in with the story of these petticoats and this maritime history. It has this quilted design of what is called a snow. My friend Rich Malley, who's a maritime historian, identified this ship for me, and he called it a very accurate, actually he said incredibly accurate depiction of a snow, which is a type of ship that was favored by merchants and privateers in the 18th century. So how cool is that? And then I also just wanted to show, this is a mermaid that's on the DAR's quilted petticoat, and mermaids show up on these petticoats on at least 6 others. just to show the varieties here of the wonderful mermaids. So the maritime context of these is so significant. And so here we are at the end. The quilted petticoats of Rhode Island and southeastern Connecticut demonstrate as clearly as the written word the relationship between those two regions, their shared maritime economy, politics, education, and religion, and women's active participation in those central issues of colonial New England society. Material evidence of European wars and the labor of enslaved servants hides within their glossy folds. I didn't cough.
Yay!
Yay. Yeah, you didn't. Well, we're so glad that you're looking pretty good. We worry about you. We've seen her, and she is in bed in her pajamas. And we're glad this is a Zoom meeting too. We all
What's
have,
a privateer?
most of us
What's
have
a
been sick.
Yeah. What's a privateer, Lynn? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I should have explained that. A privateer is a ship that is licensed by the government to go out and basically steal from the enemy's merchant ships
Wow.
and such. So it really is pirating, but it's legalized.
Yeah.
So the English would steal from the French and vice versa.
Right. And the War of
And the-
Gibraltar was actually with the
Spanish.
Spanish, and it was basically caused by sort of a privateering experience gone bad, where a Spanish captain sliced off the ear of an English ship captain, and the English ship captain complained to Parliament, and England was always good for a war, so
It's probably the best war name ever, the War of
Yeah.
Jenkins' Ear.
yeah.
Thank you.
Lynn, I just love that, first of all, that you figured out the name of the school, because no one knew that until you put the pieces together.
Well, it's all circumstantial, but
But it's pretty solid, and you know, now you didn't even have the Challoner petticoat last year when you were putting together that argument, so it's getting stronger. And I also love that you've now figured out Abigail Trowbridge, which was another mystery. And I also love that, you know, I've loved that petticoat for decades, because it's one of the costume things I'm in charge of. And I did some research, as you know, on quilted petticoats, but I never thought to ask about that ship. And I just love that you found out that about the ship. And now I'm going to have to add that to the cataloging, because that's pretty cool.
thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
fun.
It's wonderful.
Can't wait for the book to come out. So,
Oh, that's
you know,
right. Yes, thank you for that little plug.
mention
Yes,
when is the book going to come out, do you suppose?
it should
next
be
year?
out within the year.
Oh, good.
Wonderful. Well, we'll hype it here. Don't worry.
That's right, we will.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go eat some chicken soup now.
That
You do
could
that.
hurt.
Take care of yourself.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We'll miss you.
Bye, dearie. Anyone else want to talk about quilted petticoats?
Well,
Or should
I'm
we-
still, you know, so what we're assuming is that the teacher at this school provided patterns
Mhm,
and instruction,
mhm.
and people did as the teacher wanted. And that's why they look all the same, you know, all the same. I want to comment. You realize those drawings? Didn't she draw those drawings?
No, those
Oh.
are done, actually, usually she mentions it, and I think it may have
She's
been on one
sick.
of the slides, but she's sick. I was sitting through a run through of the lecture where she was presenting these recently, and we said, you need to cut a little time, just put the credit on the screen and don't mention it. And I think maybe what the screen that had that credit was gone. Linda Baumgarten, the curator
Oh,
of textiles
she
at
does.
Winter Tour, Williamsburg, who's retired, did all of those drawings, and she has allowed Lynne to use them, and it really helps you see what the designs are. But there's a very good argument for the Sarah Osborne connection, which partly involves looking at the various figures that you see and connecting them to the known samplers that are known to have come out of Sarah Osborne's school. And they, although a lot of the quilted petticoats that survived from the 18th century were imported from England or France and were done professionally in workshops, we know from advertisements, even though Sarah Osborne doesn't mention quilting specifically, other 18th century boarding school advertisements do mention quilting. So we know that quilting was quilted petticoats were being done by girls in America and learned at school. And, just design wise, all of these from Connecticut and Rhode Island go together. And, there's slight variations. So, you could have, Mary saying, oh, well, I want a squirrel on mine. Oh, I want a squirrel too, but I want a mermaid. Well, I don't have room for a mermaid. I'm going to put an extra, unicorn. And, everybody could sort of choose within a design library kind of thing.
Well, I think there's two important things here. One is because we've all been sick in February. There's something horrible about February. I've been reading a lot of Jane Austen, and her brothers were privateers. They worked for England, and they got what were called prizes.
That's right.
And then you had a privateer, you got the cargo and you could sell it. The second thing is a lot of the fabric that came to the United States and to the colonies was stolen from other ships. And, once you had this prize, you could sell it anywhere.
Captain
I think we need to know more about privateers and pirates.
Captain Wentworth in Persuasion got rich because he got all that quote unquote prize money.
Yes, and Jane knew it very well. I call her Jane because I've read so much lately. So, I mean, I think it's pretty fascinating and something we don't know very much about. Ahoy, matey, or avast, matey, I guess.
Avast.
So I'm gonna be a dumb question. I know nothing's dumb. This was these were English colonists living in Rhode Island, and they had a allegiance to the British crown. That's why it was on there.
Yeah, and some of them date as early as the 1740s, and then we think they go into the 1760s. And I'm just filling in because, as I say, we actually have another one that's from Rhode Island that I don't think is from a school, but it definitely shows signs of influence of the same group. So I've done some research on them. But Lynne has pointed out in her talks that, you see the lion and the unicorn, which are the part of the seal of the crown of England. And, there were some particularly, hooray for the happy union or whatever. That was in 1746 dated petticoat. That's a year after the Battle of Culloden, which was the last Jacobite uprising, which was the final attempt of the Scots to say, that they had the Act of Union in, I think, 1702, which united England and Scotland. And the Scots thought that the Scottish King James was the rightful heir, not these German Hanover upstarts. To be putting all of those British crown things there are statements of patriotism during a series of wars, and also right after this one last uprising trying to overthrow the English king. So it's all tied into that fact that, we think about the revolution and how we wanted to be independent and all that, but this is 1 to 2 generations earlier where everybody was a colonist, and they were absolutely tied to wanting to be British.
You wonder where the last one was made, and when the tide started to turn toward separation.
I read a book once which had a great title, When London Was the Capital of the United States, or of America.
That's great. Yeah, the capital.
When London was the capital of America.
And when you're a colonist, you haven't really, most people, I mean, some of the separatists and Puritans aside, most people aren't leaving because they're rejecting their home country. They want to replicate their home country somewhere else with better opportunities for themselves. And, just look at how, they come over here and then, all the New England places are named, Bristol, or, named after English towns and cities, and down and all up and down. And in the South, it's Williamsburg and Frederickstown, and they're all named after the Hanover princes and princesses and queens and kings. And so, they were not trying to get away from England. They were trying to very much be British. And also they had a great stake in showing that they were genteel and they were just as refined as they were over there. So they were really emphasizing their links to the mother country until the worm turned. So we have to move on, right?
We're at the end of our time for this segment.
Okay.
Merikay.
Merikay.
So Merikay is next, I believe, right? Take it away.
Yeah. Again, I missed last month's Know-It-All episode because I was in India for 3 weeks, and I could talk on and on about what I saw. It was a textile tour, but you'll probably hear odds and ends of it throughout the next year in various episodes. But for this one, with the connection to the DAR, I thought it might be fun to look at a couple quilts from the DAR and talk about what I learned about fabric printing in hands-on workshops. This is it's just a beautiful piece in the DAR collection, and it's painted according to the caption. And that's what these all were in the beginning. That was the epitome of fabric painting at the time. And as it went on, there were shortcuts and using woodblock. So I went to, one of the places I went was to this area of India called Bhuj. And in the area called Kutch, which is basically a giant desert, very dry area in the state of Gujarat. And the name of the woodblock printing, or the type of it, is Ajraka. And Ajrapur is the name of the little village that I went to visit outside of Bhuj. Our tour guide is here on the right. His name was Kuldip Gadvi. And he's a young man. He's wearing a turban that we're going to talk about. And he's about 32 years old. He has a 10-year-old little boy, but there was an earthquake in this area of India in the early 2000s and destroyed a lot of these little mud hut villages all over the area. And when the money flowed in to repair those villages, he worked for some of those NGOs. In the course of doing that, it was basically his area where he had grown up in, but he had never been out to these little villages. He met these people and he realized, there were kilns left there unused, there were looms, there were wood blocks, and a whole generation had not done the crafts that had been going on for hundreds of years. And he, along with some other people, have encouraged these villages to start up the practices again. So the one we went to was a woodblock printing area. And the piece on the left is basically his turban, but it gives you an idea of what the printing was like. It was all natural dyes and mordants. It's the three colors, kind of the madder red, a black, and they had a resist aspect to it, which I was very curious about. And then it was all, and this one was dipped in an indigo bath. So anyway, let's go through the steps. Each one of us, there were 7 women in this group, and each one of us got a chance to make a shawl. It starts out, step 1, he has the block in his hand, and he's going to dip it into this stuff. It's kind of a pasty substance, and this is what they used to mask out certain areas to keep, in this case, indigo from coming into the white areas. They put a white gauze, cotton gauze on top, and that prevents the block from dropping into it so far, and only a little bit touches the top of the design block. Now the block is there on the left, and you can see it's very intricate, and some other village has made those blocks, and there are 2 or 3 of them that work together. They are, you print them one on top of the other, but there's slight differences in them. This one is the one that was used for the resist. So he would have dipped it in that gunky stuff and stamped it here in the cloth, one beside the other. And it starts out with a very light color and it darkens as it dries. Across the top of this is a border that I didn't show you the block for that particular one, but it's a long, narrow one that has about 4 little circles on it. You'll see it later. So anyway, what you're seeing there on the white cloth is the resist. Then he puts another block on top of it. He has dipped it in a dark brown or black pigment, and he puts it right on top of the resist part. And so you could see in the picture on the right, the dark part is going to come out black on this scarf. So, and the beige is going to fall away. It's masked eventually, but now they're going to dip it in the blue. So the white here that you see is going to be blue, black, and the tan part will drop away after it's rinsed. So here he is adding red highlights to the border, and he's just putting in the red dots. He's done it already on the left. And then the final product is red and blue, red and black, and this matter, the matter red, the black, and the resist is a white, and then it's dipped in an indigo bath. Outside of this, now this is a mud little community. I told my brother the other day, who lives in New Mexico, it's a lot like the Taos Pueblo. You know, these houses are kind of all built together, and they have a little bit of plazas and yards, but it's basically mud. And remember, during the earthquake, they all fell down. So these have been rebuilt in the last 15 or 20 years. They recycle some of the iron scraps for the mordant. They use madder root for the mordant for the red. All the blocks are wiped clean after each project. And as I said, another village was making those blocks, a very intricate thing when you think about it. They're not computer generated at all. That's all cut away, very finely engineered and designed. So our block printed shawls, there were 7 of us, a couple of the other people made them. And here they are laid out on the dirt, drying in the sun. And you could see that it's still the white cloth and the brown and the black. And after the indigo bath, the rinsing and the drying again, this is what Mary Dilligan's shawl looked like. And you can see it there on the left. The bottom part of hers, where those stripy pieces in black, is not shown here. And in fact, it doesn't really show up well because she printed that in black, and the indigo is dark blue. So she's basically got a pretty dark end of her scarf, but she really liked the other end. And I think you could see what happens, that the dark brown stripes, horizontal stripes, have dropped out, and it's we've got the indigo, and we've got a white stripe and indigo and another white stripe. So, and while we were got this, I just wanted to put in, because they were working while we were, playing. This is their red. They had a red bath going too. We were using their indigo bath, but all of these pieces had been worked on in the morning and dipped, and So they've rinsed them. In the rinsing process, that's when this paste drops away, and they are putting them into a washing machine just for the spin cycle. And then they lay them out on the dry ground, out just dirt ground, and it dries up really fast. You could see they've just put the what, 7 or 8 red blobs out there, and they'll stretch them. And like I said, we didn't use the red, but this one on the right is what a shawl would have looked like. This is typical of this particular town. I went to another one, another workshop. It's called Doxta, and it was near Ranthambore National Park up near Delhi. And there I learned something that I think is pretty close to what's going on in the John Hewson prints. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But basically, we took a block and we dipped it in this case, green, and I made a border going around. And then she handed me a yellow piece that was designed so that it would put a large piece of yellow on it. And it looks like it's painted in, but in fact, it was designed to go right on top of that border. And you can see even those little yellow, those little circles and the little stripes, if you do it right, they line up, and it's really beautiful little piece. I got it a little wrong on the right side going up, but anyway, that's okay. Another thing she did was show me about this tiger. The tiger is their logo. It's a child drew a picture of the tiger at the Ranthambore National Park. And I had put the yellow in, and she went back and found a blue, a little block that fit that. They use it so much on all their pieces that they sell. So you could see where the blue covered the yellow and it became green, whereas there was a blank stripe there and it's still blue. So anyway, I thought, and then the corners were interesting too. All they did was put a piece of, you could see that piece of gray. She just put it down on the, we folded, so the point would go right, there would be a fold right to the edge of the scarf, and she lined up the piece of plastic along that. And then when I put the block down, it went right over the black plastic, and I did it the same way the other direction too. So it's funny how you don't even notice they don't exactly match, although the lines did match. So here's the John Hewson quilt from the DAR. And, there's quite a few of these that have been found. This one is interesting, I think, because it has those individual blocks. And it's pretty obvious that these are the ones I have an arrow going to. Those are all birds. They're the same ones. I didn't have a very good color picture of this, but I assume that it was made in at least 2 or more blocks, a lot like that border was printed, where the blocks were designed to go one on top of the other, and they would fit right on top of the other with a direct application of a pigment, and producing a really close registration. So these would not be hand drawn, would not be penciled. This was totally wood block producing those birds. Also the same thing with the outer border. Now, again, I think Rhonda may have even seen Rhonda and Debby on some of the borders on the Oxa Wilkins quilts. They're really intricate borders. And I think too, it's a case where it's one block on top of the other, and very similar to what we'd seen in the block printing at the first place, really the second place too. Now the center vase, the one that just screams John Hewson, has always raised some questions for me, and I still wonder about it. I've just got close-ups of 2 panels, John Hewson panels, one on the left from the Metropolitan Museum of Art compared to the one at the St. Louis Museum of Art, and you'll notice it's exactly the same in the center, that triangle. Even moving outside the triangle, it has the 4 butterflies in exactly the same place, and the 2 birds in exactly the same place too. It's almost as if the Hewson studio block printed a panel exactly the same and then sold them. Maybe they had an order to sell several of them, just like that woodblock shop was doing in India. They had an order to produce X number of shawls and sent to another part of India, or maybe even to another country. Now, we look at the Hewson quilt on the right, the center panel. It does have the same vase as the others do. It doesn't have those 2 birds at the bottom, but I'm wondering about that block. You know, was it designed as one, using one overall image, using complementary blocks printed on one on top of the other? And how big was that block? That was a huge, that's a really large vase. Or was it made of several blocks? It's really hard to tell. Here's a close-up of it, of the bottom of the vase. Again, the one on the left from the St. Louis Art Museum and the one on the right from the Metropolitan. The one on the left, you could really see the registration on these 2. It's almost like it's hand printed. And I'm even more in awe of the work of the Hewson studio, these Hewson prints. So if you get a chance to go to India, do it. People are going to ask, and I might as well tell them that the name of the group was the Travel Tribe India, and it's on Facebook. And the company that actually handled us was Wandering Earl Tours. They specialize in small group tours. The website for Cool Dip and the Kutch area was the Kutch Adventures India. He too will do private tours with 1 or 2 people. And the website to buy some of those products is there, the DocStarRanthambore.org group. So what do you think about the Hewson? I'll stop sharing there. Or what do you think about this woodblock printing? I learned a lot just because I'm trying to stop. Say stop sharing.
Spectacular, but we only have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, good. That's all right.
I want to say, unlike India, John Hewson did not have people in the next town making woodblocks. He was very limited in what he had to print. I think he assembled these things. I don't see any other way that he wouldn't have one big one. He had a vase one and he had a bird one, but they did it in factory production, sort of. But these are, you know, it's obvious they're wood blocks. And he's using, the other thing to notice in India, still they're using 2 dyes, indigo and madder. That's it. And that's what Hewson was using too.
That's what Hewson was using too? Yes.
There was an article published in Antiques Magazine a number of years ago, and I am completely blanking on who wrote it. I want to say it might have been Jan Whitlock, who was a dealer in textiles for many years. But I'll have to follow up, and we'll add it to our bibliography. I'll look it up tomorrow. I didn't know you were going to focus so much on Hewson and ask that question, but I'm pretty sure that they did come in a pre-printed block, and some people used the whole block with all the little birds and butterflies around it, and some people cut it out and moved them around as they wanted to. But this article in Antiques Magazine goes into a lot of detail of it and connects it to some French textile and wallpaper designers, and has some interesting, scholarship. And this is a good 10 or 15 years ago now, but it was good, solid new research on Hewson's designs and methods at the time. So we'll add that to our bibliography. I'll look it up.
I think that was Kim Wolford.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
must
that
be
was an
just that I've had
excellent article. Yes.
Yeah, Kim Walford, thank you. It's just that I guess I've had conversations with Jan about Hewson and things that her name popped into my brain. Thank you, Debbie.
Well, but I want to make a point. I think yours at the DIR is special because it almost looks like a sampler. It has, I'd like to go back and count how many different ones are on there compared to the ones I know are Hewson. And I think that's what makes it special.
And I remember when Kim came to see it, she was excited because she did say, I'm seeing some motifs here that I have not seen elsewhere. Right. So that was pretty cool. Unfortunately, the brown is unfortunate, but it was conserved at the time when everyone was using that brown crepeline, and I don't really know why they thought that was a good idea, but it's preserved anyway.
All right, it's time for you, Alden.
Okay, so I'm next, and I am going to share my screen and say that it was hard to decide on what to talk about because we've got 320 something quilts and quilt tops and counterpanes, and I've interacted with a lot of them over the years, either by getting them into our online database. We do have an online database that you can access through collections.dar.org and do a search. We also are on the quilt index, and so most of our quilts are there. But I finally decided to focus on this one, which is kind of an old favorite of mine. I used it in the first exhibit that I did after I became curator of the quilt collection after Nancy Gibson left. And it was called Home and Country, and it was co-curated with Olive Graffam, who was then in charge of the needlework. And we did samplers and quilts. And I'm a sucker for a good framed medallion, and I love this one. And I should have included it in Ion Elegance, because that was all about Maryland and Virginia quilts, and I'm just not sure how I left this one out or why. And although I'm darned if I know where I would have squeezed it in, because that was a pretty full gallery. But it has these inscriptions, as you can see, of and I have a detail in a moment. EM 1836 at the bottom, and it came from Missouri because it came through the McKee family. So we assumed EM was Eliza McKee, except there was a problem. And we said, okay, this doesn't really work because Eliza's maiden name was, we thought Shyrock, but you're always learning. I was looking her up and found her gravestone. She comes from a German family, Shryock, who anglicized the spelling to Shryock, not Shyrock. So now I have to go back and change the cataloging in the database. You can't see her maiden name here, but when you look for her parents on Find a Grave, that's what you find. But the problem is that quilt is dated 1836. She wasn't married until 1838. So in 1836, her last name was not McKee and her initials would not be EM. This is her obit from Find a Grave. It says she was a devout Christian and blah, 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 and she has all these children, and so on and so on. She was born in Hagerstown, which is in Western Maryland. And here's a detail of that inscription. And I'd like to point out one thing that impresses me, because I'm not a quilter, but I am a sewer, and I understand that when you look at those vines, every single one of them, everywhere that I can see, is not biased, but on the straight. And she has manipulated it just beautifully in all those miles of swag on that whole darn quilt. And it's all on the straight. And it's pretty impressive. Now, I mean, I think that the one down there, the green one around EM, I think that's actually cut out, not in a strip, but in a wave, maybe. So maybe she made a series of waves, but still, I'm going to give her some credit. And there's a little bit more. I love the vases. There are vases in the corners. And if you go back, I forgot to put a duplicate here, but look at all the vases in the corners of two of those borders, and you've got the vine border and you've got the sawtooth border, which of course is very typically Maryland. So there you go. So here we are. Robert, for years we could not find McKee who matched. On the back of the quilt, there's an inked inscription that says Evelina McKee. We could not find an Evelina McKee, but this is a good example of, well, just last month we were talking about beyond inscriptions. You have to be cautious. Is the inscription the maker or just the owner? On the back, it looked like, you know, perhaps a laundry mark. It said Evelina McKee 4 or something like that. And we couldn't find Evelina. It wasn't a daughter of Eliza and Robert, the owner, presumed owners of this quilt. But so Robert McKee, his parents marry in 1807. He ends up having one sister named Eliza McKee. Can't find a marriage or death record for her, so she may still have been EM in 1836. And then he's born in 1811. And then a few years later, his future wife is born. And then in 1817, Evelina McKee is born. So we often say this, it bears repeating. If you reach a genealogical dead end, try again in a few years, because more information will be uploaded to, you know, the internet. And we looked again. I was home during lockdown, and I had a lot of time to work on following up on some of these little lasting mysteries to get things online into our database. And bingo, we found Evelina. I think that's when we found Evelina. Debbie, if it was you, forgive me. I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Nope.
Okay, so, you know, we were able to find Evelina, and it's a brother of Robert McKee. She died in 1846, 10 years after the quilt was made. She did not marry. So she is, you know, the one who explains the Evelina McKee. So she's back in Maryland. They got married in 1838 and almost immediately moved to Missouri. So, you know, when she died, did she keep the thing, and then it got sent to Missouri after she died as a memento of a beloved deceased sister, or did she give it to them in 1838? Here's this quilt I made, but I want to give it to you for your marriage to remember me by in Missouri. We don't know, but at least we have an identification of Evelina, and it ended up in Missouri, and then it stayed in the family, and then it was given to the DAR chapter out there, and then they gave it to us in 1996. So, and Eliza Shyrock McKee lived to be quite old, 1907, and I believe she was a DAR member. I can't remember. So that's just a very brief little discussion of one little quilt. You know, there are a lot of examples in our collection where because so many get donated by descendants of the maker and members of the DAR, they have some family history attached. Sometimes there are gaps, sometimes they have the wrong generation attached. So, you know, Debbie and Virginia and I would always be digging in the genealogy records to try to either verify the history or explain the mysteries or patch up some misunderstandings or gaps. And that's just one little example, and I just think it's a very pretty quilt.
It is.
Definitely.
You know, I want to say I have a friend named Shryock.
Oh yeah?
It is not mellifluous to the English speaker.
It's not.
It really does not roll off the tongue. And he might very well be related to these people.
He could.
It's an unusual name. And I'm glad to see that you had found the German origins, because I thought it was just a very strange name.
Yeah, and I meant to mention yeah, I think her grandfather was the emigrant, and it was SCHRAIOCK, or something, you know, a bunch of different variations, as you can imagine, in 18th century records, but they just kind of simplified it to Shryock. But I wanted to point out that one of the interesting things is, you know, there are little echoes of Dutch German, you know, floral design traditions in those baskets and vines.
Yes,
that's true.
And you get that in Maryland anyway, but certainly you know, Eliza Shryock is the one with the German name, and now we know, you know, she's definitely not the one who made it. But you know, it's all in the air, it's all in the water. People are picking up each other's design traditions all over the place.
And Missouri is a very German state.
Yeah.
Well, and
As Merikay Waldvogel will tell you.
Yes, well,
That's right.
but along the Missouri River, especially, you know, Sue Ellen did a really good article back in in Uncoverings about the Germans settling in and the kinds of quilts they made in Missouri.
Oh, cool.
well,
So
and
she was just to repeat, she was the sister.
yes.
That's right. Eveline, you think?
Sister-in-law.
Eveline, yeah. We wondered if it could be Eliza McKee because it was owned by Eliza and her husband, Robert.
Right.
But it was Robert's sister. Robert
Right.
had one sister, Eliza, and one, Evelina, either one of whom could be EM, but then we have the inked name Evelina on the back.
Oh,
Well, I'd
Too
say
many
that quilt,
EMs, too many EMs.
it has
Yes, too
more
many
than-
E's.
has more than just a little bit of German influence. It's got quite a lot. Hagerstown is practically in Maryland, and it's just surrounded by German-speaking peoples back in those days, both north and south. Big German populations in Frederick County as well as Washington County. And
So it all makes sense.
yeah, and the way the surface of it is totally covered, just totally filled with wavy
Mhm.
lines, is just so much looks like Pennsylvania German folk art, and even their Taufscheins and other religious devotional items are all filled out like that.
Right.
So it really
right.
fits.
It's weird. I went online and tried to find a good image of a, you know, like a good, one of those blanket chests that would have a vase of flowers similar to that. And I simply couldn't find, you know, a good example in the time that I had. And I regret that. But anyway, everybody sort of knows what that looks like. So.
Okay, we're just about at the right point to switch to Rhonda.
Yes.
Miss Rhonda.
Oh, is it my turn? Okay. I made
Rhonda, I'm let me just do 30 seconds of me being the host because I'm supposed to do that. We are so glad to welcome back Rhonda McAllen, our guests, our special guest star, as the sitcoms used to say. And thank you for coming back on short notice, Rhonda. Rhonda's very familiar with some of our albums and the quilt she's about to discuss. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. So the counterpane that I chose is near and dear to my heart since it was made by or attributed to Asa Goodwin Wilkins. And this quilt has an interesting history. It was purchased at an auction advertised as a bedspread, and it was in the Florida estate of Asa's great-grandnephew, Edward Lasatovich. And it was purchased by a collector, Bill Volkening, who ended up graciously donating it to the DAR in 2014. But Asa is one of the most prolific quilt makers that we know of in early Baltimore. She left a legacy of applique counterpanes, which were documented by Dr. Dutton in the 1920s and the 30s. And he ended up documenting approximately 18 to 20 different works that the family thought that either Asa did, some of them her mother, Milka Goodwin, made, some of the very, very early ones. But through genealogical records and legal documents, we find that many of these quilts were the product of a group effort. It was her mother, probably her sister, servants, and also enslaved individuals more than likely played a part. There are two additional counterpanes that were not in Dutton, and this is one that turned up in the Smithsonian, and the DAR Museum's counterpane was a surprise. It wasn't in Dutton, who is really kind of wrote the basis and the story about Asa. But the DAR counterpane is constructed, we use using embroidery purse. and it has the matching fruit basket with the chintz border that goes with it. But the one thing about AXA's counterpanes that are really different from the others is that she used a machine woven mock Marseille back. And a Marseille is a all white whole cloth cotton textile that has a raised textured pattern to it, and it's woven into the cloth, and it's used so that you don't have to quilt it. In fact, none of these quilts that, at least that I have seen or that we know of, were actually quilted, and the Marseille made it look like it was quilted. So a family history of the making of these counterpanes. It was written by AXA's daughter, Hester Davis, who was about 10 years old at the time that the quilts are believed to have been made. And her narrative appears to be remarkably accurate, which is really not typical for family histories. Those of us who do a lot of this research know that, you know, it's histories tend to evolve as time goes on. But she appears to have written this narrative during the time frame that either her mother had just recently died or not too long afterwards. But Hester's story says that her mother, AXA, most frequently beguiled her weary hours of sickness by designing and laying out fancy spreads in which she displayed beautiful taste she inherited from her mother. And AXA had a subcutaneous skin ailment on her hands that prevented her from working on these beautiful counterpanes. AXA's granddaughter, Hester's daughter, actually expands the story a bit, and she says that the counterpanes were made under her direction by a group of young colored girls, possibly slaves, who had been trained by her. So after AXA's death, the counterpanes and the quilts were really treasured by the family, as well as the family of her sister, Milka Dorsey, because we find in the 1930s and 40s, when Dutton finally published his book, that all of the counterpanes that he found attributed to AXA were still in the family. But since Dutton's publication, those counterpanes seem to have disappeared off the face of the earth. There are only 3 that he documented that we actually know where the locations are. This one is at Colonial Williamsburg, and it descended through AXA's sister Milka, her family. And it has, again, the fruit basket with the matching border. There's also another quilt that descended through AXA's family through Rebecca Hammond Lasatovich, who, by the way, is the mother of Edward Lasatovich, who originally owned the counterpane at the DAR. This quilt was shown in the 1981 Baltimore Museum of Art exhibition. These 2 counterpanes are so close, it's just uncanny, and I'll get to that here in just a bit. Let's see. There's also another quilt that is in a public institution, and that is the one at the Andalusia Foundation, which is located at the Nicholas Biddle Estate near Philadelphia. This one descended through AXA's granddaughter, Letitia Glenn Biddle. It's one of several counterpanes that are attributed to AXA that contain the central tree of life design. Now, the 2 additional counterpanes that have popped up since Dutton's documentation are the one at the Smithsonian and the one at the DAR. The Smithsonian has an inscription on it, which is really interesting. So here's the inscription, and it says M.D. Davis, or A.G. Wilkins, 1820, M.D. Davis, 1890. Now, we know that M.D. Davis is actually Axe's granddaughter, Mary Dorsey Davis, who is the daughter of Hester, who wrote the original narrative. And there is another inscription, which I don't have a picture of, but it is on a quilt that was owned by Rebecca's sister. And it is the one that I had previously shown you in the Lasatovich collection that was shown at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And Dutton did record that inscription, and it says A.G. Wilkins, 1820, and R.C. Davis, 1890. Both inscriptions appear to indicate that the counterpanes were made by Axa around 1820, then inherited by the sisters. Now, both of the sisters were alive. Their lives overlapped with Axa, so they knew her grandmother. And most of Axa's younger children who did not marry lived well into the 1890s, and the sisters knew their aunts, so they were well versed in the family history. Another interesting element of this quilt is an iris that was formed by piecing the two halves together, and I've tried to show you here down this line, and we see this element in quite a few of Axe's counterpanes, and it's kind of one of the signatures I look for whenever people think, oh, I have an Axa quilt. So I say, well, does it have a pieced iris? And that kind of tells you, or at least that's a good indicator. We can talk for days and compare these counterpanes, but in trying to keep it connected to the DAR's counterpane, I wanted to make a comparison of theirs to the Lasatovich collection. And if you take a look at the southwest or southeast quadrant of both quilts, you are going to see where these fine little cut out embroidery purse chintz flowers are placed in exactly the same position on both of the quilts. Also, if you look at the only difference that you find in these two quilts is the little motifs in the festoons are different. Everything else is just about exactly the same. If you take a look at the center blocks, you're also going to find where all of these little all of these little flowers that were cut out of the chintz and appliqued onto this backing, they're just perfectly placed. So it makes me wonder, when you look at it this way, if these elements were being cut, arranged, and basted down in a type of assembly line type fashion. Because when you compare the two quilts together, I mean, they're about as close a duplicate as you could possibly get. But all that being said, I don't want to infer that in any way that this was a quilt workshop that were preparing pieces for sale. Both Axa and her mother and her sister were of the socioeconomic status and considered the Baltimore elite. They were probably three of the wealthiest, definitely the wealthiest women, if not in the top 10 wealthiest people in the city of Baltimore. So going into business or quilt business or any business of any type would really not be proper for someone in Axa's position. There are two additional counterpanes that have the center basket and have the borders. One of them is a granddaughter of AXA. We do not have a clue where that quilt is, the one on the left. And then the other one now is at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So the presence of enslaved people is also central to this story and the production of her counterpanes. While AXA would have not owned slaves due to her strict Methodist faith and her husband's position within the church, her mother did own slaves, and the 1823 Baltimore City tax records shed further light on who these young girls may have been. If you go to not really just the final tax records, but if you look at field assessor's notes when you're doing tax record study, what the tax assessor has and makes his notes and writes things down when he's actually in the field. And those tend to yield a lot more detail than any final records. But the field assessor's notes actually names 6 slaves that Milka Goodwin owned. And the names of those slaves were Maria, Juliet, Harriet, Betty, Hagar, and Caroline. So more than likely these slaves, because they were owned by Milka at the time that these counterpanes were believed to, or it's been indicated that they made, those were more than likely the slaves that at least had some part in the making of these quilts. So by exploring the construction, design, and possible time frame, as well as other documented evidence, it appears that AXA may have been one of the earliest quilt makers to design chintz counterpanes using a continuous circular borders consisting of pre-printed floral swags. Her use of Monte Marseille as the ground for her counterpanes is also rare. AXA's work also presents evidence of materials and styles favored by women of her class and the quilts produced by her family circle. So I have a question for the know-it-alls. And that is, well, let me preface that by saying there is a lot of documentation I didn't have time to present here, but I would like to get your thoughts on what time frame do you think these counterpanes were made, taking into consideration the inscriptions that were found on the sisters' quilts?
Well, Merikay and Barbara are going to be the best people to talk about the chintz medallions and the use of chintz in those after their wonderful long blog, which needs to go on our bibliography too. Let's make note about all those medallions.
Well, that's panel number 5. Merikay has given a number to every furniture panel, and it was very common in the US, rather uncommon in England. And we say on these things 20, what do we say, Merikay? 20s, 30s?
1830.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we know that that panel is in dated like that. 1833 is one that I actually own. So I'd say five years either way. Well, and that definitely lands in the time of that. This is fabulous, Rhonda. This is absolutely fabulous.
One of the details that I think has some bearing on this, and that is Milka Goodwin died in 1829. Okay, so AXA, the 1830s does show slaves in AXA's household because it was her husband that was the executor, and they were waiting to probate her will and distribute the slaves to other family members. So if Hester's story and Mary Davis's story is correct, it would have to be prior to 1829 that the quilts were made, and having used enslaved individuals to have helped in the production of them.
I'd be okay with that.
It'd be okay. I mean, we really don't have specific dates on when the stuff was imported. We just have dates on the quilts that use them.
And those panels, I think, were printed and offered for sale for quite a long period of time, weren't they? For at least 10 years, I think. Or maybe
Yeah,
not that
I think-
long.
But wasn't the ad that you found about these chintz sets being sold to private families really early, like
That was
18,
early.
19?
That was 1819 when William Wilkins, her husband, began putting those ads in papers that he had furniture chintz sets. I don't remember exactly what it said, but were offered for sale to private families. And the other thing that I think is interesting, that in 1810, there is several of the merchants began selling what they called chintz furniture chintz furniture prints with printed borderlings.
Borderlings.
Yeah, borderlings. And so I thought, the basket and the borders are definitely sets. Now, whether or not they were those sets, who knows? But that seems awful early for those to
Well,
me. So there must
John
have been
Hewson.
others.
The first ones are around the commemorative. They're the commemorative ones, 1815, 1820, out of England.
Mhm.
And, that.
Yeah. This ad, I actually clipped the ad from the paper, and it was 1810.
Wow.
So I have no idea which ones those were, and until we find a quilt that early, I don't think, out of that area, I don't think we'll ever know. But I just felt it was really interesting. When Axe's father died in 1809, he left an estate of over $500,000. That's huge.
That's
And then-
enormous. back then, yeah.
$20 million.
Yeah, and when William Wilkins died, Axe's husband, and I think it was 1832, right around in there, he left an estate almost as large.
Well,
So-
going back
I
to
think
the
we
dates,
should reiterate that William was a dry goods dealer.
Correct.
right.
That's
He
he
began,
didn't make his fortune there. He had money,
Mm.
but he was the kind of guy who liked, I guess, to have a job.
Yeah, well, no, he didn't have money. He came
He
from
didn't,
very
but he
humble
married
beginnings.
money.
He married money, and then he began dry goods, but her father disowned her when she married William.
Oh, that's right, because she was a Methodist.
Methodist, yeah.
Yeah,
But the other thing that's interesting is that William began selling Marseille
Mhm.
back around 1815, I believe it was. So that obviously, all these quilts that she was making, because they had an enormous family. It was huge. She made a quilt for every grandchild, for every child, for every niece, for every nephew. There was just a lot of quilts, and the fact that we can't find them is really, disappointing, because they're out there somewhere.
What we need
So
to
just-
do is meet in Baltimore, have a quilt day or two, and ask people to bring in the family quilts. It's one of my dreams, but, we've all got.
Well, I think
Well,
we've got
I know.
to-
I know you've done a lot of the genealogy to trace the family. I mean, this is how Nancy Gibson found all the Garnharts, the Marquis Garnhart quilts, was by tracing the different lines of the children, the grandchildren whom she knew were recipients of the quilts. And I know you've tried a lot of that too. I also know that some of the family who are known to have things are not very welcoming. So that
That's
doesn't help.
always a
That's a
problem.
problem. But
Oh.
I'm afraid we've got to move on now.
Mhm.
So
And it's your turn.
it's my turn. Okay, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This album quilt, while in bad shape, was deemed worthy of study because of the early dates inscribed on it and the suggestion that it was made for a minister, which had become a trend in the early 1840s. I wanted to learn more about the styles and the purpose of this particular quilt, so I took several years to do it, more than I wanted to, for sure. The original research had been had found major names on it, but it was incorrectly said to be the lumen quilt with an L, when the Spencerian script that they used is an S. So it was Suman. So that was the first breakthrough. We were able to photocopy the blocks, which increased the contrast and made the inscriptions much more readable. And at this point, what was thought to read Alice Leardy suddenly became Praise the Lord. The assumed recipients of this quilt was then thought to be John J. Suman, born in Frederick, Maryland in 1818. In the early 1840s, he trained for the Lutheran ministry. In 1844, he married Agnes Spence, a Baltimore resident. She would have been familiar with Maryland's quilt styles and likely got some training in sewing, probably from her mother. So she was clearly in the milieu where Baltimore albums were starting to be made. Maryland women of some means seem to have loved imported chintz fabrics for their quilts, as seen in a number of large mathematical stars and cutout chintz applique quilts like this one that were made, quite a bit of them, in the 1830s and 1840s, and up into the 1850s. Maryland women still made chintz quilts and put chintz on their borders. And this is a really nice one at the Maryland Historical Society. The newest fashion in the 1840s, of course, was the album quilt with individual inscriptions. It began in the Delaware Valley around Philadelphia and spread quickly to other locales, especially the port city of Baltimore. The blocks in this Quaker name-inscribed quilt are a combination of chintz appliques and elaborately multi-lobe motifs of the newly available calico fabrics that were affordable to women of more modest means than those who bought the chintz. In Maryland, and especially in Baltimore, calico fabrics were used to create floral designs rather than the more geometric motifs found on Pennsylvania albums. This Baltimore album style developed very distinctively all on its own. And here Jennifer is the block that Jennifer Goldsboro thought began the trend in Baltimore around 1842. It looks kind of fleur-de-lis to me, but she thinks that this is the earliest one. And here's another very early one that was in Dina Katzenberg's book, so I'm sorry I don't have it in color, but it shows a little bit of chintz here, the crossed laurel or photinia leaves, grape wreath, rose wreath, a fleur-de-lis here, much more floral. While it does have some of the more Pennsylvania looking blocks, it definitely is starting to look much more floral than the Pennsylvania quilts of this type that we see. The middle block of this quilt is in fact cross photinia plants. The green of color from its leaves has faded off. And this one has in the center the first two verses of Psalm 128. So combining chintz applique here and calico in this one with biblical verses, very similar to the Pennsylvania style, but now becoming very much into the Maryland style. And it reads, "Blessed is everyone that fears in the Lord and that walketh in his ways," and goes on to the second verse as well. It is inscribed, "And maybe, Baltimore, October the 30th, 1843, down in here. Agnes and Anne were about the same age and may have been friends because Agnes's father, John Grace, owned a foundry, as did Anne's father. Anne unfortunately died 2 years after that block was signed. in 1845, and John Grace was the executor of her estate, selling her household goods, which include mahogany chairs and tables, so she was well off, as well as the foundry that she had inherited from her father at his death. These three blocks are in the middle row. Here we have Anne's. This is John Grace, her executor, and Agnes's father. And up here is a block that is very Baltimore, and is inscribed Baltimore right in here. But the only thing I can discern from any of the rest of it is Philip. So we have three Baltimore blocks down the center. But the rest of the blocks really are in this come to John J. Suman's credit. Here he is from his picture posted on Find a Grave. And we have his mother, Mrs. Agnes, all of his siblings, one brother and three sisters. And here is his, on the block, the quilt also is his first son, John Grace Suman, and also his second daughter, named Margaret, who didn't survive more than a couple of years, so she's not even listed on his Find a Grave memorial. This is the arc of his life. Born in Frederick, trains for the ministry, meets Agnes somewhere in Baltimore. They marry there, and in 1843, he goes to this little tiny area of northern Virginia, which is now West Virginia. That was his first assignment. And his second assignment is down here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I'll get to that in a minute. Here are the small towns that he served just outside the city of Winchester, close to, not that far from Frederick, which is here, and Hagerstown, which Alden referred to, which is up here, and which I'll show you a quilt of in a minute. But very small Lutheran churches here. Berryville, Middleway, and Gerardstown. And here are some of the early blocks in the quilt. This is Agnes, done in Jefferson County, so when she moved out there. But this is John's block, and it's dated the same month that he married Agnes in Baltimore in 1844. This is one of his parishioners or congregants from Jefferson County. And here is the cross Photinia with a Suman name, Caroline Suman. I assume it's a cousin. I've never been able to figure out exactly who she is, but it's got to be a close relative. And here are some of John's pastoral duties, doing marriages, and I'm sure funerals as well. And also here is a revival meeting that he's holding in starting in May in 1846. So the typical pastor's duties in those days. But the 14 blocks on this quilt are from Reverend Suman's female congregants, mostly dated 1846, which is the year that he had to leave to go down to Harrisonburg. And they tend to fall mostly on the edges out here, a couple in here, and on this row. So the outer rows on this, both sides are mostly women from his Northern Virginia congregation. There's one from his Southern congregation, this one right here from Augusta County. There's one particularly interesting block on there, this Farmer's Fancy, which Barbara realized before I did is probably the earliest dated Farmer's Fancy block that we know of. This is a quilt from the Shenandoah Valley. It was majorly important and a favorite of quilt makers up and down the valley. And here is the first one appearing right at the head of the valley. So that was a great find. Here are a couple of similar Baltimore and Hagerstown album quilts, similar to the Suman quilt if it were in better shape. But here you're starting to see almost all calico quilts, not much chintz, even by 1846 and 1850, mostly calicos with your circular wreaths, mostly floral, getting very much away from these kind of more boxy blocks to the more flowing and lyrical, you might say. But I also began to look carefully at the inscriptions when I could read them. And fortunately, these days you can put in a few words of anything that's biblical, and it will come up with the entire verse for you. So Mrs. Jane Haylett wrote, "Her children arise and call her blessed." Catherine Fries writes, "A woman that feareth the Lord shall be blessed. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates." Mary Haller, who is, I think, John Suman's aunt, said, "She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life." And Agnes said of herself, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." Well, these women were, I think, praising Agnes for her devotion to her husband's work. So when Wanda and I did our database and table of Baltimore ministers' quilts, we included this one because of the Baltimore origin, and we assigned it to have been made for both John and Agnes Suman. 1846, he's moved down to the lower part of the valley, where they initially settle in Mount Sydney here, which is where Salem Lutheran is. He served a church in Harrisonburg for most of those years, which was partially destroyed in the Civil War. And he went all the way down here to near Fishersville. So he had quite a long haul in this circuit. So it must have been quite tiring for him to be traveling up and down this way. But they did move there in 1846. And by 1847, for some reason, Agnes writes on Anne Mabie's block, Agnes Suman, Mount Sydney, Augusta County, Virginia, 1847, and gives us the information that it was quilted in September. So it's kind of perpendicular to Anne's inscription, but this tells us that she finished it off in 1847. And here are some Shenandoah Valley quilts that show that the descriptions and interest in these quilts and the style is not that different. Here you have the cross photinia down there from Rockingham County, which is Harrisonburg, and you've got this Augusta County star and square block that's very similar to one of John's sister's blocks on his quilt. So the whole area has definite ties stylistically of quilts from the upper and lower parts of the valley and into Maryland. And here is an Augusta County quilt that looks quite a bit on its border like the Suman quilt. You see that sort of swag border in Maryland, and it was on the Hagerstown quilt too, but this one really does favor the way this one turned out. This basket block and this one are both signed by John Suman's sisters. So they really selected a design that was very popular all over the entire area. And here is Agnes's obituary, in which it says she was a woman of beautiful Christian character whom interest in church work ended only with her life. So yes, they're acknowledging here in this Harrisonburg paper that Agnes Suman was devoted to Christian works through her husband and through her church and through her own initiative. So, up here. So that's the Suman album quilt.
Well, Debbie, that I just have to, shout out to you for your in-depth research, because making all those connections and following him all the way through his many peregrinations and but this is what you see in the album quilts. The more you can dig into the names, you see these communities, and you see the knitting of those communities, and sometimes even the placement of the blocks is significant, as you pointed out. And I do think this is particularly interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but so many of them are basically, they're made in Baltimore, they're made, outside of Baltimore, but this one was made over the course of years and contributed to by people in several different stages of their married life. And I just think that that's really kind of unusual and wonderful that this whole thing builds up, and then she has to note, quilted in September 1847 or whatever. So it finally got finished, but I also start wondering, how close did you have to be invited to, there were a lot of women in all of his parishes, I'm sure. So how did you get into the inner circle to contribute a block to that quilt? So you kind of wonder, but I maybe those were just her closest friends who she invited, and it becomes a memorial of these relationships she built over the course of those years. And I think that's kind of wonderful, because quilts are so often the only document we have of a woman's life. And
Well, that's
really,
true. And
this is
I
really
think
a very eloquent one.
it's certainly possible that the purpose of this quilt changed over time, because the central blocks of Maryland, and it's her father, not her mother, but her father and someone else from Baltimore, and perhaps a friend of hers. So its purpose then is hard to discern. But of course, she left Baltimore and went to Northern Virginia. And at that point, with her husband taking up his first circuit, things may have changed, and she decided to just devote the quilt to her husband and his family and his ministerial duties.
Yeah. It's
I think
great.
it's so important that Debbie and Rhonda, their research that they've been doing, is we find more and more that our knee-jerk reaction, our first impression of these album quilts is marriage. People will say, well, she was married in 1842. The fashion started out far more connected with quilts made for ministers, I think, rather than the classic marriage or wedding quilt. And I think that's very important that you've changed the way I look at them.
I mean, they're community projects is the thing.
Yeah.
Certainly plenty of people were getting ready for the household in preparation for marriage, but you were doing that over the course of years, not just in the few months of preparation for your actual wedding. But things like this, these were community projects, and I think they speak more about community. And one of the quilts I'll be including in my exhibit next year will be the Sykes family album quilt. And if you doing the family research on who all of them are, they're almost all family and in-laws and cousins and the children of the nieces and so on. And it's all about the community, whether it's within a family or outside the family also. And that's a very different thing from just saying, well, I'm making this for Mary's wedding.
Except for the Jewish quilts. The Jewish quilts that I had found are all made by one maker.
They're not a community.
They're not community.
I'm not saying all of them. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But
the ones with all the signatures, the ones with all the different blocks and different signatures.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's interesting that
thank you for making that exception.
It's the Jewish quilts, for some reason, that only had single makers, and I'm not sure why that is, other than it was, more of a closed society, but no, but you're right. The other album quilts tend to be more community or a family, where a lot of different people in the family are contributing the blocks. So
I think
brides.
We look back and look romantically at this, and we forget how important the church was.
I think it was the
Heather.
center of a lot. I mean, a family's piety was judged on the woman's work
Mhm.
Yeah.
within the church.
Well, and also in a very mobile society, well, I mean, for a woman, there were limited opportunities for a woman to have a network outside the home. You weren't supposed to,
Mhm.
if you were good middle class, you weren't supposed to have a job. If you were lower class, your job was not going to be a fun place. It was going to be a factory. You probably didn't, have a great fun network there. But, for these women, church was the source of their social life mostly. And then if you're moving around, the first thing you do is clue into your church, and bingo, you've got an instant social circle to, feel that you belong to this new community that you don't know anyone in. So it was very important, both genuinely for many people who were truly devout and believers and so on. But as you say, you were also very much judged by your participation and your behavior there.
And I have one more thing to say. Debbie just throws us out a photinia.
Yes,
Now
it's
we
time
would
for
call
yours.
those laurel leaves,
Yes.
but we've decided amongst ourselves that they're photinia, which
Well, that's
is very
for-
much like that, and it's PHOTINIA, and
Well, that's
very much a native plant of the area.
Well, that's Virginia Viss's research. In her essay in the Ion Elegance exhibit catalog, she pointed out that we call them laurel leaves, but laurel leaves don't do that. But the photinia bush, the new leaves at the top of the branch will be red. And so that's why we have started calling it photinia. So, and we hope that it catches on. So that's another thing to put in the bibliography is Virginia's article.
Paper on photinia, and maybe a link to an actual photinia plant.
Time to hand it over to you, Barbara.
All right, me, I'm last here. I'm glad to, let's see. I got to share my screen.
We always say ahead of time that we're going to do 5 or 6 minutes, and then 7 or 8 minutes, and it'll all add up to 90 minutes, and it never does.
Well, it's going to be 2 hours, kids.
We don't get a lot of complaints, so.
No, we don't. So I'm sharing my screen. That's my title for me. So I chose to talk. I want to get rid of all you guys over there. There's too many of you. Let's see if I can, well, never mind, I can't. Put you down there anyway. My choice was this wonderful silk quilt made by a woman named Catherine Sheely Fretzlin. And I just put up this blog post from 2009, which gives the basics about Catherine Sheely Fretzlin. We've really had a hard time figuring out what her spelling of her name was. And we have to remember that variable spelling was the standard in the 19th century, but it seems to me that this is a misspelling. And I will show you as we go through this how I think it is spelled. It's dated 1776 to 1876, seems to be a centennial quilt to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the United States. Now, here we have the name Arkansas Catherine Sheely Fretzlin. Arkansas, I've talked to Alden about this. I think she made that up. I don't think that's her name at all. But there was kind of a trend for naming children for states. I've heard of Indiana's. I found a woman who must have been a fan of Stephen Douglas who named her girls Kansas and Nebraska, Kansas-Nebraska Act. But anyway, Arky, as she was known, is the person who is attributed to have made this. It's a pretty wonderful, wonderful example of a small show quilt. I think it's about 60 inches. These tended to be rather small because, they were not meant to be slept under. Here we have more about Catherine Sheely Fretzlin. Virginia Viss has found a picture of Arky, and I found a picture of someone who looked quite a bit like Arky over there sewing away, embroidering all this floral work on a black silk. Actually, this picture of the sewer is probably from the 17th century. But, women's work, it doesn't change too much. Now, you look at this and you go, Archie, that's a lot of work. How long did it take Archie to embroider all this? Here we have some more information about her name, Fritz Lynne, and this is on her grave. You can see it at the top here. She was usually called Catherine, but here I did find one reference to Mrs. A.K. Fritzlin in a social note in Nicholasville, Kentucky, where she lived. So she seems to have used both names. Now, Nicholasville, Kentucky, it sort of sets up our first impression. Kentucky quilt. Tend to think mountain quilts, tend to think primitive, folky. But I have to say the people in Nicholasville would have been a little bit offended. Nicholasville was only 10 miles from Lexington. So this railroad here would get you there quite quickly. And Nicholasville was, I think, a fairly elegant little place, although it was a little place. And what I want to show you here is this is Archie's house during the Civil War. So Archie was not what you tend to knee-jerk think or romantically think of a Kentucky woman named Archie. She had some money. Now, they didn't hold on to this house, and they might have sold it because, you know, the war was so hard on everyone, their economic situation. But this was their home. I don't think it probably had that facade when they owned it, but that's it fairly recently. Nicholasville was a kind of classy little place. It had the Jessamine Female Institute, a nice girls' school. It was substantial, looks like my hometown, where a lot of brick buildings. And it had many little stores, including the Lowry store here. These are the Lowrys, and they are running a grocery store. And I'll show you that because Archie's husband owned a store. And we shall look here. I think that's all I want to say about Nicholasville. Oh, Nicholasville was close to Lexington. And you may think of Kentucky as a rather rural, rather crude, rather hillbilly-like place. Don't tell that to people from Lexington. I grew up not that far from there. It was an incredibly elegant place. All you have to do is ask Mary Todd Lincoln, who grew up there. It was very much the Athens of the West. And I'm sure that Nicholasville, only 10 miles away, borrowed a lot of that elegance from Lexington. Now, as I say, Archie's husband, Joseph, was a store owner. I'm going to move us guys again because we're in the way here. But he was a shoe seller. Possibly when he was young, he was born in 1828, he made shoes. But at the time that Archie made this quilt in the 1870s, he probably was selling factory-made shoes. Here's a woman and her daughter kind of eyeing shoes from the era, the late 19th century, the time around when Archie was making this quilt. Her husband was one of the few shoemakers in Nicholasville, but there were many, many in Lexington. And I bet you they sold some pretty elegant shoes. Now, you may think about boots. You say a shoe and boot maker. I'm going to show you some very elegant boots. This is something that was very fashionable in the 70s. They were called French opera boots. They had French heels. The best were from François Pinet of Paris. These are amazing. And just look up Pinet boots because museum collections have them all over the world. They were exported all over the world. And even in Lexington, Kentucky, you can find ads for French opera boots. And I mean, it's just kind of amazing that these shoes exist, and I knew nothing about them until I started looking at Archie's work. So I thought, well, who did the embroidery here on these French opera boots? So I started poking around, and I found a couple of things. I'll summarize. In France, I think Monsieur Pinet, for many years, bought embroidered silk from people in Germany and France, women who sat home and embroidered all day long and sold it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But by 1876, when Archie was making that quilt, things were getting awfully industrialized. So I started fooling around and looking at industrialized embroidery. And what I found was that Haverhill is since Lynne's not here, I don't know how to pronounce it. Massachusetts was a great center of machine-made embroidery. And I just kind of arbitrarily started looking at the town. And here it says, someone's talking about it in Shoe and Leather Reporter. You have to read the Shoe and Leather Reporter to learn about shoes. But anyway, a velvet opera hand-embroidered toe piece and cut with a low vamp. And here's the vamp. The vamp is this particular part of a shoe. And do notice that Monsieur Penet put a lot of bows on his quilts, his shoes, and those were commercially made too. But anyway, it's a very tasty slipper, and I'll say it is. I wouldn't mind having one of these. And now I know why you need a maid to help you get dressed every morning. So I just picked a guy, Mr. Stark, from the town of Haverhill, and he had a factory in one of these buildings on Washington Street. He died about 1910. 1914, it says right there. But before he died, in the years of the early 20th century and late 19th, he did a lot of machine-made embroidery on silk. He says here, he had 30 employees, and he would sell you, if you ordered it, 9 yards of silk embroidery. Now that's a lot of silk embroidery. When I first looked at this, I thought, somebody had to sew a lot of embroidery. But if this is machine made, it's definitely within the reach of the average Lexingtonian or even someone from Nicholasville 10 miles away. And I would think that having a husband who was in the shoe business, by that time, they were doing very much commercially made shoes, but she had access to the information as to where you could get this stuff. And there was a lot of it out there. I just picked Mr. Stark as one, but there were many, many factories that employed people to work on machines to do embroidery. And you can find ad after ad, one in machine embroidery. So Stark might have provided embroidery for shoes. He certainly did some shoe work. So here we have Archie's quilt with some details of that beautiful embroidery. And here we have a French shoe. The connection visually is just too coincidental. So I thought, well, okay, so Monsieur Penet was getting embroidery from Germans and French people, imports to the United States, perhaps. Where do you look for imports? You look in the tax laws. So I'm going to go into that in a minute, but I forgot this one. So here, Alden mentioned these dresses. I'm going to move you guys again. These beautiful dresses were embroidered and imported, completely made from Japan. There were many, many places where you could get machine-made silk embroidery. That might have been handwork from Japan. So I wonder if Archie's embroidery, which impressed me so much at first with all her industry, was not commercial. And she bought it by the yard. I went back to, as I say, I went back to the tax records. Before we had income tax, our major way of supporting the government was import taxes. And there was lots written on it. So I found in 1886, somewhat elaborating with this red arrow here about some cotton velvet embroidery that was cut in slips or patterns of the size and shapes of slippers. Now, I think the word slips and slippers have nothing to do with each other, or very remote. But slippers, of course, these are toe vamps. You could embroider them yourself, and Godey's had tons of patterns. And apparently the V&A has patterns going back into the early 18th century. There's not much difference. What can you do on a toe vamp? You could do it yourself, but you could also buy them. And they were taxed. Oops, I'm going to go too fast. So there's all the law. And that was interesting to go through all the various taxes. I'm not doing very well here. I'm keeping where I want to be. So I'm wondering if so much of Archie's quilt was not commercially machine embroidered in 1876. We have this dichotomy where we look at these and our first reaction, which is so hard to break, is what an industrious and skillful woman she was. What a good shopper she was, is what we should be saying. So then you get into the next fashion. Archie was working in 1876. By 1882, everybody was doing crazy quilts. And I realized when I look at this one, which has no name, no one associated with it, but it is once more a Kentucky quilt. And they made some of the best silk quilts in Kentucky, especially in Lexington and Louisville. But whether these are not, see these shapes that are the same repeated over, are not purchase strips for a dress front perhaps. And this kind of thing is not machine embroidered. Here's what Virginia says. We refer to Virginia a lot. We give her a free ticket. For the quilt maker with more enthusiasm than skill, you could purchase a patch and then attach it with some kind of embroidery or some kind of a securing stitch. Now, my friend Louise Tiemann, my pen pal, is the expert on these slips used in crazy quilts. The woman has found ads, and then she has found many, many slips in crazy quilts that are obviously purchased from that particular company. So what I want to say here in my short presentation is that we've got to start thinking more in terms of commercial production rather than some woman sitting there in the dark trying to thread that needle. If she sewed it at all, she just secured it down. Now, there were people who could sew embroidery, and there are girls who went to embroidery school. But I think for the most part, we have been duped into thinking that they're better at using their time than we are. They were just good shoppers. So that's what I have to say. I think it is. Yes, it is.
Barbara, I've often wondered whether that was machine embroidery, because it is certainly, as we know, possible by that time. But I just love the connection you made to the shoes. That had never dawned on me, and I absolutely love it. And I can't wait to. Now I have all this work to do later this week, updating some of my.
And don't you want some French opera boots?
You guys.
Yes,
Yeah, we all
I definitely do.
Wanda would look the best of them. But it's
Barbara,
pretty amazing, the connection there. And I have a bunch of Kentucky quilts with this very elaborate. I'm going to give a paper. I should put the ad up when we're doing this in April at the Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas quilt study on Kentucky quilts and how the fashion migrated to Missouri in April. So I've been working on these Kentucky quilts, and I keep looking at them. She didn't do that. She bought it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way to tell that it was machine?
Oh, if you could, I think if you look at it right now.
Sometimes you have to be able to look at the back, but
Yeah.
there's no way that, and I don't consider myself really good at it yet by any means, but sometimes you can look at it and there's just a certain regularity to it. And then if you sort of follow the way the stitches are composed, you say, that's not the way a hand stitched thing would do it. That's how a machine would be doing it.
It's sort of more like this.
Yeah, it's more like this, back and forth and back and forth. But usually the back of it is the giveaway, because you can see that that's not how someone going in and out and in and out would do it. And you don't have floats and so on. But it's hard to just explain without having a bunch of examples in front of you. And of course, you can't see the back on this one.
Because they're quilted or backed.
But you could also see that being, a cottage industry kind of production. And of course, the colors look so beautiful, and it looks as if it's so beautifully, elegantly shaded. Well, back in the 18th century, early 19th century, women are doing those very elaborate pictorial needleworks, and they're very carefully choosing all these different shades to get the shading to look almost like a painting. But that's just variegated thread. That's just ombre thread. So, it's all those flowers are looking beautifully shaded, but it's just because it's the variation of the dye of the thread.
one more illusion.
Yeah, not to put it down, it's beautiful.
put
It's
it down.
just, you
It's
know,
just
we don't
good.
have to, you know, extol the virtues of this industrious woman that, I mean, she was industrious doing her piecing, etc. But, you know, we don't have to sanctify every process.
And I do know that when I show that, people, the first reaction they'll say is, oh my gosh, she did a lot of embroidery on that. They can't not think of the poor woman. Oh,
Yeah.
I like to embroider. The woman just sitting there hour after hour. And then they usually say, and she must have been nuts. Well, I think Archie might have been a little bit nuts. In a good
Isn't that the classic example of work smart, not hard?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. I'm writing that one down, Rhonda. So I guess if we have nothing else to say,
We'll
we'll
wrap it up.
we'll have
Thank
to
you
say thanks
all
for
for
inviting
coming.
us to the DAR.
Well, thank you all for inviting yourselves. I think it's a great idea, and I love the insights that you all have presented, and I'll be following up on some of that new information. So it's great. All right. So join us next month, everybody. Thank you so much. And we'll add the bibliography, and it'll eventually be on Vimeo, and Tara will give you all that information because she's in charge of all of that.
Right.
So good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you.
quilting.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you a
Thank
lot.
you.
That was great.
Did you know you can watch our previous episodes on Vimeo? Vimeo.com/quiltdistrict/VOD_pages. Or you can search for the 6 know-it-alls when you go to the main page of Vimeo.com. You can also catch our first 3 episodes, which are free, on our YouTube channel. You can go directly to our YouTube channel, or you can go to youtube.com and search for the 6 know-it-alls. You can also find all the updates and links to previous episodes on quiltdistrict.com. Go to quiltdistrict.com and then the 6 know-it-alls tab, and there you'll find all the upcoming episode information, as well as the background on how the 6 know-it-alls got started and some biography information on all of the know-it-alls. You'll also want to be sure you put your email address in here so that you can get notified of upcoming events straight to your email inbox.
And I'm harping on this because lighting is so important to understanding the seasonal rhythms of quilting in this early period and why it began to change in the 19th century.
But that's not the way we use it, just to stick it in there. And so often you will find some turkey red pieces just put in there for a little flair. Even this one has a little bit of red down there, although that's a wool.
This is one quilt that I wanted to talk about today because we just were able to add it to the collection last year. Yeah, it was on loan for many years from the family. And some of you know the quilt maker Anna Catherine, known as Catherine Hummel Markey Garnhart of Frederick, Maryland. And thanks to my predecessor, Nancy Gibson, we now know of 10 quilts made by Markey Garnhart. And we now own 3.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that is very interesting that it's made for the wife of a minister. And I have never heard of the lady sewing group being called a circle of industry. So that's quite interesting. I wonder if it's belongs to that denomination, if there are others that call themselves something similar.
So I just wanted to show how the designs of these bed rugs relate to whole cloth quilt and other types of quilts. So here we have one of the foot bed rugs, and here we have a whole cloth quilt that was made by Olive Curtis Baker in Connecticut. And the stitching of this whole cloth quilt is basically pretty much the same idea as you see in the bed rug.
The thing is, and this goes back to Lynne too with the bed rugs. If we were looking at men's work, if we were looking at ceramics like graffiti plates or painted chests, we wouldn't be thinking of it as a hobby.